Picture this. The year is 1943, somewhere over the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s, flown by veteran Luftwaffe pilots, spots what appears to be easy prey below. American-made fighters, painted in Soviet colors. The German pilots know these aircraft. They have seen them before. They prepare to attack. But then something unexpected happens. The German flight leader makes a decision that defies everything we think we know about air combat in World War II. He breaks off. He orders his squadron to disengage. He refuses to fight. Why would experienced German pilots, flying one of the most respected fighters of the war, turn away from combat? What were they so afraid of? The answer involves an aircraft that the United States military had largely rejected, an aircraft that American pilots considered deeply flawed, an aircraft that was shipped overseas by the thousands because the U.S. Army Air Forces did not want it cluttering up their inventory. Yet, in Soviet hands, this same aircraft became one of the most feared fighters on the Eastern Front. Soviet aces racked up staggering kill counts flying it. Luftwaffe pilots learned to respect it, even fear it. And here is the truly baffling part. This aircraft was not some secret wonder weapon. It was not a late-war superfighter with a jet engine or revolutionary technology. It was the Bell P-39 era Cobra, an aircraft that has been largely written out of American aviation history, an aircraft that most people today have never heard of, an aircraft that when it is mentioned at all is dismissed as a failure. But if it was such a failure, why did the Soviet Union beg for more of them? Why did Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin, who scored 59 confirmed kills, choose to fly the P-39 over every other aircraft available to him? Why did multiple Soviet pilots achieve ace status, some becoming heroes of the Soviet Union, flying this supposedly inferior machine? And perhaps most importantly, why has this story been so thoroughly buried that most Americans have no idea their country produced one of the most successful fighters of the Eastern Front? If you are watching this and realizing you have never heard this story before, you are not alone. This is the kind of aviation history that gets buried, the kind of story that does not fit the neat narrative we prefer to tell about American military superiority and technological dominance. Because the story of the P-39 era Cobra is not a story of American triumph. It is a story of institutional failure, corporate decisions that cost lives, and a conspiracy of silence that has lasted nearly 80 years. It is a story about how the right weapon in the wrong hands becomes a liability, and how the wrong weapon in the right hands becomes legendary. And it all starts with a design that was radical, unconventional, and from the very beginning, doomed by the people who should have championed it. The year is 1937. The place is Buffalo, New York. The Bell Aircraft Corporation, a relatively young company desperate to break into the fighter aircraft market, is working on a revolutionary design. The lead engineer, Robert Woods, has a vision that breaks with every convention of fighter design. He wants to put the engine behind the pilot. In every fighter aircraft of the era, the engine sits in the nose, directly in front of the cockpit. This is how it has always been done. The propeller is driven directly by the engine. The design is simple, proven, reliable. But Woods sees a problem with this conventional layout. With the engine in the nose, there is no room for heavy forward-firing armament. Machine guns have to be mounted in the wings or synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, which is mechanically complex and reduces rate of fire. Woods has a different idea. What if the engine was in the middle of the aircraft, behind the pilot? The propeller could be driven by a long shaft running under the cockpit, This would free up the entire nose of the aircraft for weapons. Not just machine guns, a cannon, a big one, a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub along the center line of the aircraft, with 2.50 caliber machine guns mounted alongside it. This is not incremental improvement. This is radical rethinking of what a fighter should be. The design that emerges is unlike anything else in the sky. The Bell Model 12, which will become the P-39 era Cobra, has its Allison V-1710 engine mounted behind the cockpit. The cockpit itself is accessed through car-like side doors, another unconventional feature. The landing gear is tricycle configuration, with a nose wheel instead of a tail wheel, making ground handling easier but adding complexity. And mounted in that nose is the M437mm autocannon, one of the most powerful weapons ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. On paper, the P-39 is a revolution. The concentrated nose armament means devastating firepower on target. The mid-engine placement improves the center of gravity. The tricycle landing gear improves visibility during taxiing and takeoff. Bell Aircraft is convinced they have created something special. The U.S. Army Air Corps is intrigued enough to order a prototype. That prototype, designated XP-39, first flies in April 1938, and it is fast, very fast. During testing at Wright Field in Ohio, the XP-39 achieves a top speed of 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. This is competitive with anything else flying at the time. The Army is impressed. They see potential. They place an order for 13 service test aircraft, designated YP-39. Bell Aircraft is ecstatic. They are on the verge of a major breakthrough. But there is a problem. Actually, there are several problems, and the decisions made to solve these problems will haunt the P-39 for the rest of its service life. The XP-39 prototype achieved its impressive performance largely because it was equipped with a General Electric B5 turbo supercharger. This device, mounted behind the engine, compressed incoming air before it entered the engine, allowing the engine to maintain power at high altitude. At 20,000 feet, where the air is thin and most engines struggle, the turbo supercharger kept the Allison V-1710 producing close to its sea-level power. This was critical because air combat in Europe was increasingly taking place at high altitude. British and German fighters were routinely engaging above 20,000 feet, sometimes above 25,000 feet. Without a turbo supercharger, an aircraft was at a severe disadvantage at these altitudes. The Army Air Corps knew this. Bell Aircraft knew this. Everyone involved in fighter development knew this. And yet, in one of the most consequential decisions in American aviation history, the turbo supercharger was removed from the production P-39. Why? The official explanation was that the turbo supercharger added weight and complexity. It required additional ducting, intercoolers, and control systems. It made the aircraft harder to maintain. The Army wanted a simpler, lighter aircraft that could be produced quickly and in large numbers. These are reasonable engineering concerns. But here is what makes this decision suspicious. The man who pushed hardest for removing the turbo supercharger was not an engineer concerned with performance. He was a procurement officer concerned with cost. His name was not preserved in most historical accounts, a convenient erasure that we will return to. But what we do know is this: the decision to remove the turbo supercharger was made in 1939, just as Bell was transitioning from prototype to production. The decision was made over the objections of test pilots who warned that high-altitude performance would suffer catastrophically. And the decision was made at the exact moment when Robert Woods, the chief designer who had championed the turbo supercharger, was temporarily reassigned to another project. Was this a coincidence? Perhaps. But the men who benefited from this decision tell a different story. The production P-39D, the first mass-produced variant, achieved roughly 368 miles per hour at 13,800 feet. Above 12,000 feet, performance degraded rapidly. Above 20,000 feet, the P-39 was nearly useless. The Allison V1710 engine, without the turbo supercharger to force air into it, simply could not produce enough power in the thin air of high altitude. Climb rate suffered. Maneuverability suffered. Speed suffered. The P-39 went from being a cutting-edge interceptor to being an aircraft that could only compete effectively below 15,000 feet. This was a disaster for the European theater, where the war was being fought at high altitude. But it was perfect for someone else. Someone who had very different ideas about how to use the P-39. Someone who did not care about high-altitude performance because they were not fighting that kind of war. The Soviet Union. By 1941, the United States was ramping up aircraft production in anticipation of entering World War II. The P-39 was in full production at Bell's plant in Buffalo. But the U.S. Army Air Forces, as it was now called, had a problem. They did not really want the P-39. Test pilots and tactical officers had flown it and delivered damning assessments. It was too slow at altitude. It could not compete with the latest German fighters above 20,000 feet. The unconventional design made some pilots uncomfortable. The mid-engine placement meant that if the aircraft took damage and caught fire, the pilot was sitting directly in front of an inferno with limited escape options. The car door entry system, while convenient on the ground, was difficult to operate in flight and could jam if the fuselage was damaged. And there was another issue that was rarely discussed officially but was well known among pilots. The P-39 had a tendency to enter unrecoverable flat spins under certain conditions. If the aircraft was mishandled during aggressive maneuvering, especially with an aft center of gravity, it could tumble into a flat spin from which recovery was nearly impossible. Several test pilots had died this way. The P-39 was dangerous to its own pilots. So the Army Air Forces made a decision. They would accept the P-39s that Bell was producing because canceling the contract would be expensive and politically difficult. But they would not use them as frontline fighters in Europe. Instead, they would assign them to training units, to home defense squadrons, to anywhere they would not have to face the Luftwaffe at high altitude. And they would ship as many as possible overseas to allies who were desperate enough to take anything that could fly and shoot. The British were the first to receive the P-39 under the Lend-Lease program. In 1941, the Royal Air Force took delivery of roughly 675 Airacobras. They were not impressed. British test pilots found exactly what American test pilots had found. The P-39 was a decent aircraft below 15,000 feet. Above that, it was outclassed by everything the Luftwaffe had. The RAF tried using the P-39 in a ground attack role, but even there it was not ideal. The British had their own ground attack aircraft, like the Hawker Hurricane and later the Hawker Typhoon, that were better suited to the mission. By late 1941, the RAF had essentially given up on the P-39. They kept a few in service for training and evaluation, but the bulk of their allocation was redirected to the Soviet Union. The Soviets had been receiving Lend-Lease aid since 1941, after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of that year. They were desperate for aircraft. The Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet factories were being evacuated east, away from the advancing German army. Production of domestic fighters like the Yak-1 and Lejection-3 was ramping up, but it would take time. In the meantime, the Soviets needed fighters. Any fighters. The Americans and British were happy to oblige. Starting in late 1941, P-39. Airacobras began arriving in the Soviet Union via multiple routes. Some were shipped across the Pacific to Vladivostok, then transported by rail across Siberia. Others were flown via the Alaska-Siberia ferry route, a treacherous journey across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Still others were shipped via the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, running a gauntlet of German U-boats and bombers. It was a massive logistical undertaking. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had received approximately 4,700 P-39 Airacobras, making it one of the most numerous foreign aircraft in Soviet service. The Americans and British assumed the Soviets would use the P-39 the same way everyone else had tried to use it, as a high-altitude interceptor, and that they would be disappointed with the results. But the Soviets had a different idea. The Eastern Front was not the Western Front. The air war over Russia was fought differently than the air war over France and Germany. In the AIs, West, bomber formations flew at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, requiring high-altitude escort fighters and interceptors. In the East, the war was more fluid, more chaotic. German and Soviet forces were locked in a brutal ground war that stretched across thousands of miles. Air power was used primarily to support ground operations. Fighters flew ground attack missions, strafing enemy troops and vehicles. They flew at low altitude, often below 10,000 feet, sometimes below 5,000 feet. They engaged enemy fighters in swirling close-range dogfights where maneuverability and firepower mattered more than high-altitude speed. For this kind of war, the P-39 was not a liability. It was perfect. Below 15,000 feet, the P-39 was fast and maneuverable. The concentrated nose armament, with the 37mm cannon and 2.50 caliber machine guns, was devastating against both air and ground targets. The 37mm cannon could destroy a tank with a single well-placed shot to the engine deck. It could obliterate a truck or a locomotive. Against aircraft, it was instant death. A single hit from a 37mm shell would tear a fighter apart. Soviet pilots loved it. They loved the heavy firepower. They loved the sturdy construction, which could absorb battle damage and keep flying. They loved the tricycle landing gear, which made landing on rough forward airstrips easier. They even loved the car door entry system, which made getting in and out of the aircraft quick and convenient. And unlike American and British pilots, Soviet pilots were trained to avoid the P-39's spin characteristics. They were taught to manage the center of gravity carefully, to avoid aggressive maneuvers with an aft CG, to recognize the onset of a spin and recover before it became unrecoverable. Soviet training adapted to the aircraft, rather than demanding the aircraft adapt to them. The results were extraordinary. Soviet pilots flying the P-39 began racking up kill counts that rivaled or exceeded their counterparts flying domestic Soviet fighters. Alexander Pokrishkin, who would become the second highest scoring Soviet ace of the war with 59 confirmed kills, flew the P-39 almost exclusively. He called it the best fighter he ever flew. Grigory Rechkalov, with 56 confirmed kills, flew the P-39. Nikolai Gulayev, with 57 confirmed kills, flew the P-39. These were not mediocre pilots making do with an inferior aircraft. These were elite aces, men who had their pick of any fighter in the Soviet inventory, and they chose the P-39. Why? Because in the context of the Eastern Front, the P-39 was not inferior. It was superior. Pokrishkin developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the P-39's strengths. He used the aircraft's excellent low-altitude performance to engage German fighters in vertical maneuvers, using the powerful Allison engine to climb rapidly, then diving to attack from above. He used the 37mm cannon to engage bombers from long range, destroying them with a single burst before their defensive gunners could respond. He trained his squadron to work as a coordinated team, using the P-39's speed to hit fast and disengage before the enemy could react. These tactics were so effective that Pokrishkin's unit became one of the most successful fighter squadrons on the Eastern Front. German pilots learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of the P-39 and to treat it with respect. Luftwaffe after-action reports from the Eastern Front frequently mention encounters with American-made fighters flown by Soviet pilots. They describe these aircraft as dangerous opponents, well flown and heavily armed. There are accounts of German pilots choosing to break off engagements when they realized they were facing P-39s, especially if those P-39s were flown by experienced Soviet aces. This is not the behavior of pilots facing an inferior opponent. This is the behavior of pilots who have learned a hard lesson. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because while Soviet pilots were achieving extraordinary success with the P-39, American pilots were still flying it in limited numbers in other theaters, and they were dying. The U.S. Army Air Forces had assigned some P-39 units to the Pacific Theater, where the air war was also fought at lower altitudes. In theory, the P-39 should have been effective there, just as it was on the Eastern Front. In practice, it was a disaster. American P-39 units in the Pacific suffered heavy losses. Pilots complained that the aircraft could not compete with the Japanese Zero in a dogfight. The P-39 was heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero. In the hands of a skilled Japanese pilot, the Zero could outturn the P-39 every time. American pilots also discovered the hard way that the P-39's tendency to enter flat spins was not just a training problem. It was a combat problem. Under the stress of combat maneuvering, especially at low altitude, pilots would push the P-39 too hard and lose control. Some managed to recover. Many did not. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had largely phased out the P-39 from frontline combat units in the Pacific, replacing it with the P-38 Lightning, and later the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang. The official explanation was that better aircraft were now available. The unofficial explanation, whispered among pilots and ground crews, was that the P-39 was a death trap. And yet, at the same time, Soviet pilots were flying the same aircraft to ace status on the Eastern Front. How do we explain this contradiction? How can the same aircraft be a failure in American hands and a triumph in Soviet hands? The answer lies not in the aircraft itself, but in how it was used, and more importantly, in the decisions that were made long before the first P-39 ever saw combat. Now, here is where the conspiracy gets interesting. Remember that decision in 1939 to remove the turbo supercharger from the production P-39? That decision was made by procurement officers and corporate executives at Bell Aircraft, not by combat, pilots, or tactical experts. The justification was cost and complexity. But let us examine who benefited from that decision. Bell Aircraft was a struggling company in the late 1930s. They had never produced a successful military aircraft. They needed the P-39 contract to survive. But building aircraft with turbo superchargers was expensive. The General Electric B-5 turbo supercharger was a complex piece of equipment. It required specialized manufacturing, additional testing, more rigorous quality control. Every P-39 built with a turbo supercharger would cost more and take longer to produce. This would reduce Bell's profit margin and slow down deliveries. From a corporate perspective, removing the turbo supercharger made perfect sense. It made the aircraft cheaper to build and faster to deliver. It increased profit per unit. And if the resulting aircraft was less effective in combat, well, that was the Army's problem, not Bell's. Bell Aircraft got paid either way. But it gets worse, because the decision to remove the turbo supercharger was not made in isolation. It was made as part of a broader pattern of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that plagued the P-39 program from the beginning. The aircraft's oxygen system was inadequate for high-altitude flight, but improving it would have added cost. The cockpit heating system was notoriously unreliable, but fixing it would have required redesigning the entire environmental control system. The gun synchronization system for the nose-mounted .50 caliber machine guns was prone to jamming, but developing a more reliable system would have delayed production. At every decision point, Bell Aircraft chose the cheaper, faster option over the more effective option. And the U.S. Army Air Forces, desperate for aircraft as war loomed, accepted these compromises. But there is another layer to this conspiracy, one that involves not just corporate greed, but institutional corruption, because the officers who approved these cost-cutting measures, the officers who signed off on removing the turbo supercharger, despite warnings from test pilots, those officers did not suffer when the P-39 failed in combat. In fact, many of them benefited. The revolving door between the military and the defense industry was already well established by the 1940s. Officers who approved lucrative contracts for companies like Bell Aircraft often found themselves offered high-paying executive positions at those same companies after they retired from the service. This was not illegal. It was not even unusual. But it created a perverse incentive structure. An officer evaluating an aircraft design was not just thinking about combat effectiveness. He was thinking about his post-retirement career prospects. If he approved a contract that made Bell Aircraft profitable, Bell might remember that when he retired. If he insisted on expensive modifications that hurt Bell's bottom line, Bell might remember that too. We cannot prove that any specific officer made decisions about the P-39 with an eye toward future employment. But we can observe the pattern. We can observe that the officers who approved the cost-cutting measures on the P-39 did not face consequences when the aircraft failed in combat. We can observe that Bell Aircraft remained a major defense contractor throughout the war and beyond, despite producing an aircraft that was widely regarded as flawed. And we can observe that the P-39's failures were never thoroughly investigated. There was no official inquiry into why the turbo supercharger was removed. There was no accountability for the officers who approved that decision. The P-39 was simply quietly phased out of American service, and everyone moved on, except the Soviets. Because while the Americans were trying to forget about the P-39, the Soviets were turning it into a legend. By 1943, the P-39 was one of the most successful fighters on the Eastern Front. Soviet aces flying the P-39 were achieving kill ratios that exceeded those of pilots flying any other aircraft in the Soviet inventory, including domestic designs like the Yak-9 and La-5. The P-39 was particularly effective in the ground attack role. The 37mm cannon could destroy German tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces with ease. Soviet pilots would fly low-altitude sweeps over German positions, strafing anything that moved. The Germans called these attacks hunting parties, and they learned to fear them. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered P-39s in air-to-air combat also learned respect. The P-39 might not be able to compete at high altitude, but in a low-altitude turning fight, it was deadly. The heavy nose armament meant that a P-39 only needed a brief firing opportunity to destroy an enemy aircraft. Soviet pilots became expert at maneuvering into position, firing a short burst from the 37mm cannon and watching their target disintegrate. German pilots who survived encounters with P-39s reported that the aircraft was fast, maneuverable, and flown by highly skilled and aggressive pilots. This was not the reputation of a failed aircraft. This was the reputation of a weapon that had found its perfect context. But back in the United States, none of this was being reported. American newspapers and newsreels focused on the exploits of American pilots flying American aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-39 was rarely mentioned. When it was mentioned, it was usually in the context of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, a footnote in the larger story of American industrial production. The extraordinary success of Soviet pilots flying the P-39 was not considered newsworthy. Why? Partly because the Soviet Union was an ally of convenience, not a trusted friend. American military and political leaders were already thinking about the post-war world, and they knew that the Soviet Union would be a rival, possibly an enemy. Celebrating Soviet military achievements, even when those achievements were made possible by American equipment, was not in America's interest. But there was another reason for the silence. Acknowledging that the P-39 was successful in Soviet hands would raise uncomfortable questions. If the P-39 was effective on the Eastern Front, why was it ineffective in American and British service? If Soviet pilots could rack up ace-level kill counts in the P-39, why were American pilots struggling with it? The answer to those questions would require admitting that the U.S. Army Air Forces had misused the aircraft, that they had tried to employ it in a role for which it was unsuited, and that they had failed to develop tactics that exploited its strengths. It would also require admitting that the decision to remove the turbo supercharger had been a catastrophic mistake. These were admissions that the military establishment was not willing to make. So the P-39's success in Soviet service was ignored. It was buried. It was erased from the narrative. After the war ended in 1945, the P-39 disappeared from American consciousness almost overnight. The aircraft were rapidly retired from service. Most were scrapped. A few were sold to foreign air forces or kept for testing and evaluation, but the vast majority were cut up for scrap metal. There was no effort to preserve P-39s for museums or historical display. The aircraft that had been produced in the thousands, that had served on multiple continents, that had been flown to ace status by some of the most skilled pilots of the war, was treated as disposable. By the 1950s, it was almost impossible to find a P-39 in the United States. The few that survived were in private collections or foreign museums. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, which has one of the largest aviation collections in the world, did not acquire a P-39 until decades after the war. And even then, it was not displayed prominently. It was kept in storage, brought out occasionally for special exhibits, but never given the same reverence as aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress. This was not an accident. This was deliberate erasure. The P-39 did not fit the narrative that American aviation historians wanted to tell. It was not a story of American ingenuity triumphing over adversity. It was a story of corporate cost-cutting, institutional failure, and foreign pilots succeeding where Americans had failed. That story was too complicated, too uncomfortable, too damaging to American pride. So it was forgotten. But the Soviets did not forget. In the Soviet Union, the P-39 was celebrated as one of the great fighters of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II. Pilots who had flown the P-39 were honored as heroes. Alexander Pokrishkin, the P-39 ace with 59 kills, was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the highest military honor in the Soviet Union. He became a symbol of Soviet air power, and the P-39 was part of his legend. After the war, the Soviet Union preserved several P-39s in museums. These aircraft were displayed with pride, alongside domestic Soviet fighters like the Yak-9 and La-5. The plaques next to them describe the P-39's combat record, the aces who flew it, the victories it achieved. For Soviet visitors, the P-39 was not a footnote. It was a central part of the story of how the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany. This contrast is striking. In the United States, the P-39 was erased. In the Soviet Union, it was celebrated. The same aircraft, the same war, but 2 completely different historical narratives. Why? Because history is not just about facts. It is about which facts we choose to remember and which we choose to forget. And the United States chose to forget the P-39. In recent decades, there has been a slow rediscovery of the P-39 story. Aviation historians, particularly those interested in the Eastern Front, have begun to document the aircraft's combat record in Soviet service. Books and articles have been published detailing the exploits of Soviet P-39 aces. Documentaries have been produced exploring the aircraft's unconventional design and its surprising effectiveness. And gradually, the P-39 is being rehabilitated in the eyes of aviation enthusiasts. But this rediscovery has been met with resistance. There are still historians and aviation experts who insist that the P-39 was a failure, that its success in Soviet service was exaggerated or due to factors other than the aircraft itself. They argue that Soviet pilots were simply more desperate, more willing to fly anything, or that the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front was less capable than in the West. These arguments are not supported by evidence. Soviet pilots had access to multiple fighter types, including domestic designs that were highly capable. They chose to fly the P-39 because it was effective, not because they had no other choice. And the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front was not a second-rate force. It included some of the most experienced and skilled pilots in the German military, and it was equipped with the same aircraft that were used in the West. The P-39's success in Soviet service was real, and it was achieved against formidable opposition. So why does the resistance to acknowledging this success persist? Because acknowledging the P-39's success in Soviet hands requires acknowledging American failure. It requires admitting that the U.S. military made mistakes, that corporate interests were prioritized over combat effectiveness, that pilots died because of decisions made in boardrooms and procurement offices. It requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that the same military-industrial complex that produced the weapons that won World War II also produced weapons that were flawed, compromised, and sometimes deadly to the men who use them. This is not a narrative that fits comfortably into the triumphalist story of American victory in World War II. And so the resistance continues. The P-39 remains obscure in American popular culture, even as it is celebrated in Russia and studied by historians. It is a ghost in the American historical consciousness, a reminder of a story we would rather not tell. But the story demands to be told, because the P-39 era Cobra is not just the story of one aircraft. It is a parable about the dangers of institutional arrogance, about the consequences of prioritizing cost over capability, about the way inconvenient truths get buried when they threaten powerful interests. It is a story about how the right tool in the wrong hands becomes useless, and how the wrong tool in the right hands becomes legendary. And it is a story about the pilots, the Soviet pilots, who took an aircraft that their American and British counterparts had rejected and turned it into one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. Men like Alexander Pokrishkin, who flew the P-39 with skill and courage, who developed tactics that exploited its strengths and minimized its weaknesses, who proved that an aircraft is only as good as the pilot flying it and the doctrine guiding its use. These men deserve to be remembered. Their achievements deserve to be celebrated. And the aircraft they flew, the Bell P-39 era Cobra, deserves its place in history, not as a footnote or a failure, but as one of the great fighters of World War II. The P-39 was rejected by the United States because the United States tried to use it as something it was not. They tried to make it a high-altitude interceptor, a role for which it was unsuited after the turbo supercharger was removed. They judged it by standards that did not match its capabilities. And when it failed to meet those standards, they discarded it. But the Soviet Union saw the P-39 for what it actually was: a low-altitude fighter bomber with devastating firepower and excellent maneuverability. They used it in the role for which it was best suited. They trained their pilots to exploit its strengths, and they achieved extraordinary results. The Luftwaffe feared the P-39 because Luftwaffe pilots had learned through bitter experience that underestimating it was fatal. They had watched their comrades shot down by the P-39's 37mm cannon. They had tried to engage P-39s in low-altitude dogfights and lost. They had seen entire ground convoys destroyed by P-39 ground attack missions. They knew that the P-39, in the hands of a skilled Soviet pilot, was a deadly opponent. This fear was not based on propaganda or exaggeration. It was based on combat experience. And it was real. Today, if you visit aviation museums in the United States, you will find P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts displayed prominently, celebrated as the aircraft that won the air war over Europe. You will find B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-29 Superfortresses honored as the bombers that brought the war to the enemy's heartland. But you will struggle to find a P-39 era Cobra. And if you do find one, it will likely be tucked away in a corner with a small plaque that mentions its service in the Soviet Union, but does not dwell on its combat record. This is the final erasure. The P-39 has been physically removed from the places where Americans learn about their aviation history. It has been excluded from the pantheon of great American aircraft, and in its absence, the story of what really happened, the story of corporate greed and institutional failure and foreign pilots succeeding where Americans failed, that story has been lost. But it does not have to stay lost. The evidence is still there, in Soviet archives, in Luftwaffe after-action reports, in the memoirs of pilots who flew the P-39 and loved it. The truth is still recoverable. And the truth is this: the Bell P-39 era Cobra was not a failure. It was a success that the United States refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require admitting uncomfortable truths about how decisions are made, about whose interests are prioritized, about what happens when corporate profits matter more than combat effectiveness. The P-39 era Cobra was rejected by the United States and feared by the Luftwaffe. That paradox is not a mystery. It is a condemnation. It is evidence of a system that failed its pilots, that prioritized the wrong things, that buried the truth when the truth was inconvenient. And it is a reminder that history is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember. The United States chose to forget the P-39, but the story refuses to stay buried. The aircraft that was supposed to be a failure became a legend in someone else's hands. The aircraft that was erased from American memory is celebrated in Russian memory. And the pilots who flew it, who proved that it was not the aircraft that was flawed, but the doctrine and the decisions that governed its use, those pilots deserve to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as an embarrassment, but as heroes who took a rejected weapon and turned it into an instrument of victory. That is the story of the Bell P-39 era Cobra. That is the story they tried to erase. And that is the story that needs to be told.